I'm Pastor Terry Anderson, and I'm here with my good friend and colleague, Janet Altmeyer, who is the Director of City Ministry for Trinity. Janet, May is Mental Health Awareness Month.
It is. I'm wearing my green ribbon, and it is important for us to remember that we're highlighting the opportunity for us to be mindful of our emotional well-being and to help support one another in that effort.
And what are the particular issues that Trinity looks at when it looks at Mental Health Awareness Month?
Especially now during COVID-19, when there is extensive isolation and we are separated from one another to a great degree, struggling with feelings of loneliness and, for some people, grief, sadness, separation for long periods, that can take a toll on our emotional well-being and our overall mental health. So Trinity wants to remind us through our website and through our practices and services that we are here to be present with one another during this somewhat auspicious and sometimes frightening time.
And I would simply echo what you said about this being a particularly difficult time for people. When we think of mental health, sometimes we think about people with significant mental illnesses, but mental health is much more than that. We all have a sense of emotionality about our lives. And one of the things that we know is that when stress impacts us in a significant way, even those worries and sadnesses that normally we would get through without too much difficulty become much more pronounced. And when we think about stress, stress in itself is often thought to originate in what we call the fight or flight dynamic. And for me, a good illustration of that is a picture that I have in my mind of a cave person from the Stone Age walking around the side of a mountain, and he or she encounters a saber-toothed tiger coming from the opposite direction. And there's a moment of indecision. Do I fight this tiger or do I turn around and run? And that moment of deciding is when we feel significant stress.
So true, isn't it? And we can think of so many different examples of that. I often am finding myself during this particular time also experiencing the freeze option, fight, flight, or freeze. And there have been moments where I have felt a bit stuck during this time, especially with the challenge of not being able to plan very far in advance for things. I'm a planner. I know a lot of the people that I work with are planners also. To feel that there are not a lot of options for me and for others puts me in that mindset of frustration in the freeze moment. So helping one another get out of that feeling of being stuck can be a support also.
Yes, I think that that's very well said. And you know, we certainly recognize that we don't have many experiences these days that mimic the walking around a corner and running into a tiger. But there are other things that threaten our way of life and that threaten the way we think about ourselves. And as you point out, I think very, very clearly, is that in the situation of a pandemic, when we really can't escape it, it's there constantly as a part of our experience, we do often feel just frozen or stuck in place.
I also think that the situation that we are all sharing, and one of our colleagues so aptly described it, and I've held on to this pretty tightly, it is that we are not all in the same boat. She described it as saying we are all in the same storm, but we're in different boats. And isn't that true? We have a lot in common during this time. And part of that, I think, is also our challenge for maintaining good mental health.
Yes, we have a lot of in common, but as your illustration in hers points out, we're in some ways in it by ourselves, in our own boats, and I think that makes it so much more difficult because then we're dealing with those feelings of being isolated and being lonely, and we don't have those natural supporting groups and resources that we would normally
Or necessarily a solid port.
have. That's right. That's right. We don't
Things
know
keep
exactly
moving
where
on
we're
us,
going.
yes.
Yeah.
So true. As a clinical psychologist, Terry, a lot of people know that you are a pastor and that you've been a pastor in our community for many years, but you're also a counselor and a therapist. Can you share with us any insights about how we might find some solid grounding during this time of insecurity and uncertainty, feeling isolated? Are there some strategies that you can recommend?
Sure, I would be glad to respond to that. That's a big question and would probably take a long time to really answer adequately. But I think the place that I would start is by trying to normalize behavior to some degree. You know, some of these things like worry and anxiety, sadness and depression are on a kind of continuum. And for most of us, we experience, all of us, I think, some worry and some sadness in our lives. But when we are in situations like this, where there is significant and ongoing stress, those feelings get intensified and exacerbated and may even move us more in the direction of true clinical anxiety or depression. But one of the things that we can do is simply to recognize that it's not unusual and there's not anything wrong with us because we're feeling an intensification of those emotions. So one of the things is to kind of cut ourselves some slack and just say, I'm not a desperate, I just have these very strong feelings. And I think that that's something that a lot of people share right now. The other thing is to be able to distinguish between what is kind of day-to-day worry, what is day-to-day sadness, versus what are kind of more clinical or professional issues. And I think with both anxiety and depression, we see differences in the way our body responds. We may eat less or sometimes eat more than we normally would. We may have disruptions of sleep where we either sleep too much or we have great difficulty sleeping. We may be in a state of constant worry or constant sadness. We may have feelings of panic and even feel heart palpitations. So there are, of course, other symptoms to pay attention to, but I think the significant thing is to recognize and accept that many of those feelings are normal, but when they slide to that side of being more severe and really interrupt our daily living and our disabling, that's the time to be talking to someone, often a professional, and doing something to sort that out.
Absolutely. And we are here at Trinity always ready to listen and to be supportive. Our pastors and our staff, directors and facilitators of small groups. We are always ready to listen and to hopefully lend a supportive ear. And on our website, there's going to be a list of community resources. We'd be happy to help people navigate those as well if they feel that they might want someone additional to speak with about these challenges. Also, there's kind of a neat new opportunity now called, many people have heard of crisis lines. Others have heard of hotlines for people of different ages. But now there's a new trend, which I can imagine could be very helpful, called warm lines. And those are just opportunities for people to have a friendly ear, to say that they're not alone, that there is someone who wants to listen to them, to chat with them, and it's not because they're having an emergency per se. They just need connectedness. And we know that staying connected can help us in our isolation and our loneliness.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. That's a very interesting idea. one of the points that I would often try to make is that, you know, the pastors of Trinity Church and the other professional staff of Trinity Church are not here to be a counseling agency. They're not here to be a social service agency. But that doesn't mean that we're not prepared to listen and talk and to help connect people with other resources when they're in need.
Absolutely. And at one time or another in our lives, we all need someone to talk to. And it might not be that person who is with us constantly in our home, or that person that we have relied on through friendships or through family that are not necessarily with us. We just need another set of ears to listen and walk alongside us. And that's that continuum you referred to, that we're at a different place in time right now. So our needs might perhaps be somewhat different. I did see a bulletin board, if you will, on a church sign this past week, and it said, "Love is patient and kind and is not irritable." And I thought, oh, well, I guess maybe I'm not as loving as I want to be sometimes. I have found myself feeling a little bit more irritable, especially as these days wear on. And I think that's part of, as you say, Terry, cutting ourselves some slack and cutting others some slack in our relationships with colleagues, with friends, with neighbors, just adding a little bit of patience in our interactions, because this is new territory, and people's best intentions sometimes might fall short, and we have to be willing to forgive ourselves and others, I think.
I think that's well said. Irritability is sometimes a symptom of anxiety or depression as well. And for me, and I, call myself out on this in my own life, is that it is important to accept that a certain amount of that kind of comes with the territory of being a human being and comes with the territory of this unusually stressful situation. On the other hand, those things don't give us permission to attack other people and be unkind in the way that we respond. So for me, it's a kind of balancing act between accepting a certain amount of irritability and negative feeling, but at the same time not acting that out so much with others. Another thing that I thought we might talk about today that I think is very important in this time and is relevant to Mental Health Awareness Month is that of grief. I know that we have talked about this before, and we typically as a society, we think about grief as those sad feelings that we have when a loved one dies, and that certainly is grief. But grief has so many shapes and forms and expressions. In this day, we feel some grief often because we do feel lonely. We can't spend time with those that we love. We feel like for some people, their time is slipping away from them, and that there is a loss in that, and there is a grief about that.
Yes, and sometimes I find myself feeling kind of a wave of sadness that I eventually have discovered that feels like grief. And it can come over me very unexpectedly. And it even elicits a feeling of tearfulness and sometimes tears, when in previous times I wouldn't have experienced that. And a good friend of mine who works for Visiting Nurse in Hospice described that to me as being ambiguous grief. And that was a new term for me. She said that they're seeing at the counseling center, specifically for grief, a lot of ongoing sad feelings about the loss of things like prom, or having play dates and sleepovers, or and we must be reminded that mental health and mental well-being applies to people of all ages. So children, young people, adults, seniors can experience grief and these feelings in many different ways. And an overall sense of loss can just sometimes feel overwhelming.
And it just it breaks my heart when we think of situations, some of them in our own congregation, of people residing in care facilities and unable to have visitors. And it's just heartbreaking on both sides. It's extremely lonely and isolating for those who are residents of those facilities, but it's also so sad for the people who love them who cannot come to visit. And that is a significant grief, I believe.
Definitely. I'm sure that all of us can think of those things about which we are sad. We have a sense of loss, and looking for the hope that perhaps is there whenever possible. And we certainly, as people of faith, rely on each other to help us hold that hope for one another. If one cannot hold it for oneself because of those overwhelming circumstances or the ongoing nature and time of this, the protracted nature of this, perhaps it's kind of a nice reminder through our phone calls and our Zoom time and our FaceTime and our meetings with one another, family and friends, that if you're interacting with someone who can't seem to hold hope for themselves in the moment, maybe you can help hold it for them until they can eventually find that sense, hopefully through faith and trust and the confidence that we have in the knowledge of our faith, and keeping that alive for one another and with one another during this time.
Yes, and there's no denying that this is a very difficult time for all of us. And I would not try to discount that in any way. But one of the things that's helpful to me is to try to think of the positives that I can find even in the most difficult times. And one of the things that has been a real recognition for me is simply the value of relationship. You know, we miss those that we love, and so we find ways to make those connections beyond the usual ways, and I think it gives us a greater appreciation for those relationships. And with our time in isolation, which of course is not a good time, but we also have opportunity for prayer and reflection and things that we don't always take time to do in our busy lives.
It's true. And I have found, and again, perhaps trying to live with a sense of gratitude as well, that this time has afforded me some opportunities I was not anticipating. So with its challenges have come some opportunities as well. I know that when the weather has permitted, I have really benefited by some alone time in our garden, really following nature closely, looking for the changes in each day. That has been very grounding for me. That's an easy way for me to feel gratitude, because it's just such a wonderful opportunity to see God's hand in beauty and creation. But there are other opportunities too. As you say, a time for reflection. Some people are using this time for journaling or creativity. I've been working on a doodle that has consumed my pen and my writing time during staff meetings. And I'm thinking about framing it when this is all said and done. But having a creative outlet has been very helpful, and kind of takes me out of my head a little bit. Do you have any strategies like that you appreciate?
Yeah, I think another thing that is important to note, and I feel a little bit hypocritical saying it because I'm not always very good at it, but ensuring that we get some physical exercise. Whatever that is, whether it's walking or running or using exercise machines, but all of us can find ways that we can exercise our bodies. And one of the things that we know from some fairly significant research is that exercise is not only helpful to our physical bodies, it is helpful to our emotions. And so in these difficult times when we feel this extensive and significant stress, to exercise will help with some of those feelings. Yeah, regardless of what it is, whether it's working in the garden or going for a run, we need to find ways to be intentional about breaking the patterns of negativity in which we may find ourselves in this difficult time.
I read an interesting article this week comparing the effects on the brain of exercise and prayer's effect on the brain. So just as we can perhaps get a reset through exercise and other positive outlets, prayer can benefit our spirit, as we know, but also our brain.
Yes. Yes.
So I found that very interesting. As we are moving forward through this unusual time, do you consider, Terry, the importance of saying to ourselves, what do we know to be true? What can we count on right now?
Yes, I think that that's very important because one of the great difficulties with this time is the uncertainty of it. And there's no way to avoid some of the uncertainties, worries about health, worries about employment and economic difficulties, worries about our families, and uncertainties about how those things will resolve and when they will resolve. And so at that point, I think it's very important for us to look at what are the things that we know to be true. And those things may be different from each of us. I would count a relationship with God, the love of family, the gifts of nature, those things. How about you?
I have used that strategy with my students many times over the years, and I try to use it with myself. A good friend and colleague of mine said this morning, boy, I'm grateful for my sense of humor. And she does have a funny sense of humor, and as she said, it has served her well. Those kind of personality traits that allow us to get through the moment. I think that those are something for which we can all be grateful. And I must say that during this time when isolation is a given, and loneliness and sadness and grief and anxiety and depression are all words that many of us are using during these strange times and during Mental Health Awareness Month, that one thing that we know to be true is that if there is any positive opportunity for us to be engaging in, it's building community, staying strong with one another, staying strong in our faith with one another, holding that up for each other, coming together as we're able, staying in community, staying connected, finding new ways to be connected is one way to find balance during this unbalanced time. And I'm very grateful for the knowledge that I continue to have that my church and my church family will always be with me. And we hold that up during this Mental Health Awareness Month as an opportunity for our community to count on us as we are counting on them.
I think that's wonderfully said, and that's probably a good place for us to stop. Thank you very much for those words. Thanks for our conversation, and thanks for our friendship.
Right back at you, Terry.